Okay. Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Bill Barabalt. I'm President and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's a pleasure to have you all here this evening. I think many of you know we're actually doing a simulcast into the theater, so we have some 800 or 900 people here tonight. So thank you for coming. Please, before beginning, I'd like to introduce everyone to some very special guests. Longtime friend and supporter of the Richard Nixon Foundation and a patron of the arts, Mrs. Ruth Shannon. And a very close friend of President Nixon, a personal friend, and a football player, although he claims they spent most of their time on the bench, and former chairman of our foundation board of directors, a man who just celebrated his 102nd birthday this June, Hubert Perry. We are most honored to have former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright with us this evening. Born in what was then known as Czechoslovakia, Dr. Albright and her family fled their homeland twice, first from the Nazis and then from the communists. Her father, a Czech diplomat, sought and received political asylum for his family in the United States, and Madeleine Albright sailed into New York Harbor on Armistice Day, November 11, 1948. 49 years later, she became our country's 64th Secretary of State and the first female appointed to that position, becoming the highest-ranking woman in the history of the United States government at that time. She began her career in politics as an aide to then Senator Edmund Muskie, and then served as a liaison for Congress for the National Security Council during the Carter administration. Following the election of Bill Clinton from 1993 to 1997, Dr. Albright served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations and was a member of President Clinton's cabinet. In 1997, she succeeded Warren Christopher as U.S. Secretary of State. Dr. Albright is a great example of the fact that a Secretary of State never retires. She is currently chair of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. She serves on the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Policy Board, serves on the Board of Directors of the Council of Foreign Relations, and the Board of Trustees of the Aston Institute, and a number of other boards. She is chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, and Albright Capital Management, an investment advisory firm focused on emerging economies. Dr. Albright is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including Read My Pen's Story from a Diplomat's Jewel Box. We are extremely proud to have Read My Pens, the Madeleine Albright collection, a special exhibit featuring more than 200 pens she wore to commemorate messages during her time as America's top diplomat. The exhibit is on display in the Hall Gallery through September 27th, and we encourage you to visit that exhibit. I'd also like to introduce our speaker, moderator, and conversationalist, Michael Ellzey. On January 20th of this year, Michael was appointed by the Archivist of the United States as the director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, one of 13 libraries in the Presidential Library System. In joining the library, Director Ellzey continues a distinguished career in public service, appointments with 7 mayors in 3 different California jurisdictions, San Jose, San Francisco, and Orange County. In 2008, Michael was appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Orange County Great Park Corporation to oversee the conversion of the former Marine Air Station El Toro into a 1,300-acre metropolitan park in the heart of Orange County. Educated in California at San Jose State, a law degree from Lincoln University, Mike served proudly in his country during the Vietnam era. So please join me in welcoming former Secretary, Dr. Madeleine Albright, and Michael Ellzey.
Test. All right. Thank you for joining us this evening at the Nixon Presidential Library. Tonight we're privileged to have with us one of the great influencers of our time. We're going to have a conversation with Secretary Madeleine Albright. Madam Secretary, I hope it's clear by the numbers tonight that Orange County loves you.
Thank you. Well, if I might say, I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank Bill for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. Not long ago, I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and this lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." And I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And then I was going through the magnetometer. The TSA guard looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia. And if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia. And you're always welcome in Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you?" So we get our picture taken. It screws up the whole line. I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State." And she said, "Of Bosnia? So thank you."
Well, on that note, you've clearly lived a remarkable life, Madam Secretary. You've undoubtedly influenced the lives of millions over the course of your life's work, some very personally and some on a global scale. We're here tonight because jewelry has been a big part of your life. As a young child, as a Wellesley girl, as a mother, as a world leader, and now as a leader in global affairs. So why don't we just kick it off by asking you when the role of jewelry in politics first touched your life?
Well, I am delighted to be at this incredible library and to have a chance to participate and see the great exhibit and just be here in the East Room and have the opportunity. Thank you. So I clearly like jewelry. So what happened when I was made Ambassador of the United Nations, I got there in February '93, which was after the Gulf War. And the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions that kept coming up for votes. And I was what is known as an instructed ambassador, and my instructions were to make sure that the sanctions stayed on. And so I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein constantly, which he deserved. He'd invaded Kuwait. And so what happened after a while, there was a poem that appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them, an unparalleled serpent. And I happened to have a snake pin. So I wore the snake pin when we were talking about Iraq. And you know that, I think everybody's seen pictures of the ambassadors when they come out of a Security Council meeting, the press is standing there. So all of a sudden some camera zeroes in and the reporter says, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" And I said, "Because Saddam Hussein compared me to an unparalleled serpent." And then I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry that was going to reflect what I thought we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons, and on bad days, insects and carnivorous animals. And the other ambassadors began to notice all that because I was the only woman on the Security Council. And so then they said, so what are we going to do today? And the first President Bush had said, read my lips, no new taxes. So I said, read my pins. And that's how it all began.
So the first pin was Serpent's Tail. That was the story that
Right.
you just
Yeah.
relayed. Another pen, or a second pen, that came along that also began to influence, began to advise the world that you were using these as a part of your diplomatic arsenal, was the Bluebird pen, having to do with Cuba.
Right.
Could you share that story with us?
It's a little dirty, but anyway.
We are in Orange County, and that's why I asked.
Okay. So this is what happened. By the way, what had happened was President Clinton had thought about normalizing relations with Cuba when he came into office, and we had some very private talks about that. And what happened then, I'm sure many people remember, was that there were unarmed civilian planes that were piloted by people called Brothers to the Rescue, Cuban Americans, and they were shot down while over international waters. And so I was in New York as ambassador, and I got instructions to make sure that the Cubans were condemned for what they did. And so the government gave me a transcript of what the Cuban pilots were saying to each other as they were chasing these unarmed planes around. And it was bloodthirsty, and everything was in English except one word, cojones. And so, and it was, we have cojones, they don't have cojones, and it really was fairly disgusting. So, and so I thought that, again, I had a press conference there, and I developed this line which said, it's not cojones, it's cowardice. President Clinton thought it was a great line, but my job was to make sure that we got condemnation of the Cubans, which I did manage to do in the middle of the night, having made a deal with the Chinese, whose instructions, they can always delay their instructions because night is day. But I had given up my right to, in the interim, I had become president of the Security Council, and I had given up my right to speak with a national message. And so I had to listen to the Cuban condemn me for everything. Now, the Bluebird I wore during the press conference because with the head down of the bird in honor of the fallen pilots. So President Clinton asked me to go down to Miami when the memorial service was held for the fallen pilots, and it was huge. They did it in the Orange Bowl, and I walked in through the tunnel that the dolphins come in, and all of a sudden 60,000 Cubans got up yelling, Madam Cojones, Cuba Libre. So that is the story of the Bluebird. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it didn't take too long to understand that some of your pins are edgy, some of them are warm, and some of them carry a diplomatic message. And you have a couple of great examples in your book about warm pins. And I just wanted you to talk, I think two of these you characterize as having a character of their own, a category by themselves. The first one is about global warming and your interest. And of course, we're fast forwarding. Your life since you were a young girl all the way through to today is emblematic of the use of these pins. Yep. And so CO2 yep. is something that's important to you. It's a trip to the Arctic. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it was interesting because I am on the board of the Aspen Institute, and along with National Geographic, we decided to have a trip to the Arctic on an icebreaker. And we flew first into Oslo and then to this island called Svalbard and got on an icebreaker to go up to look at the ice melting. What was really interesting was that we had to sail for 2 days before we actually hit ice, which really was an example of wow. how much has been melting. Mm-hmm. And I actually call this trip Egos on Ice. because the people that went on it was President Carter and Chevy Chase and Ted Turner. So there were a lot of egos out there. But we did see what was going on. And one of the parts I have to mention is because it was in the summer and night is day, and so it's light all the time. And all of a sudden we would be sleeping, and like 4 in the morning, the voice of God would say, "We have just sighted polar bears 5 miles to the starboard." So you get up and you're up on the deck, and all of a sudden they say, "Okay, there are polar bears, and the polar bears are behind that piece of ice that looks like a rock, and then there is this other piece of ice to the left of it that has a hole in it, and then behind that there's another piece of ice, and the polar bears are there." And you can't see them because it's foggy, and everybody's waiting for you to sight the polar bears. And so I finally said, "Yes, I see them." And they said, "No, you're looking in the wrong place." But what we did was really understand the melting of the ice, and this pin was given to me up there, which really explained a lot of what was going on. And it's quite stunning because and you get very caught up in the food cycle because the polar bears eat the fish, and there are a lot of questions about who is in charge of what. What is interesting are the polar bears are the most dangerous animals in the world, apparently, when they stand full height. So given the egos that were with us, they were quite afraid of these. By the way, we went in Svalbard to this place that is the repository of all kinds of seeds that might disappear. Chevy Chase says, "I hope you haven't kept broccoli."
And the second pin that you categorize in such a way also relates to a trip, a very interesting confluence of events on a trip to New Orleans. And that's one of my favorite pins that I see in our exhibition, one of the most beautiful pins. Yeah. And that's called the Katrina pin.
Right.
You named that the Katrina pin. Perhaps you could share that story.
Well, that was very special. I went to New Orleans right after, a couple of years after the Katrina, and I had been asked to go to the World War II Museum, which in itself is an incredible museum. The Enola Gay is there, and a number of aspects from World War II. And then afterwards, there was a dinner, and Lindy Boggs spoke, a number of different people. And so what happened, all of a sudden, I'm sitting there at dinner, and this young man comes over, and he says, "My father is sitting over there. He's a World War II veteran and had 2 Purple Hearts." And he opens this box, and it's this beautiful pin with 2 amethysts in it, clearly signifying the Purple Hearts. And he said, "This is what my father gave to my mother on their 60th wedding anniversary, but she died as a result of Katrina. And we want you to have this pin." And I said, "I can't possibly accept this pin." And he said, "No, she loved you, and you would honor us if you took this pin." And so the Katrina pin is very symbolic of the kind of message that an inanimate object can really send. And it's a beautiful pin, and I'm honored to have it.
It's also It's also representative of the heights and the depths of the origin of the pins. And by the way, there are more than 200 of these pins in our exhibition, and I hope that you have a chance to come visit sometime between now and September 27th. It's absolutely beautiful, and look for that pin, the Katrina pin, if you get a chance. On the edgy side of the pins, I just am fascinated by this one development, and you shared a story earlier with us today, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the trip to North Korea. And I characterized that as a standoff, almost literally, with the North Korean leader. Perhaps you could share that story with us.
Well, what had happened, this was in the fall of 2000, and we had had a lot of dealings with the North Koreans as they had pulled out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, had been very threatening, and what had happened was that the number 2 guy to Kim Jong-il had come to the United States in order to invite President Clinton to come to North Korea. And President Clinton rightfully said, "I might come at some point, but I'm not just coming. The Secretary of State has to go first." And so we had no representation in North Korea, so we had no idea what was going to happen, and very little information about Kim Jong-il himself. Our intelligence said that he was crazy and a pervert. I found out that he was not crazy. So, I get there, and they put me into a guest house, and you're sitting there, and in the guest house, you know they're listening to everything that you say. Plus, I hadn't realized that when you type on a computer, that just the way that the letters sound, they can tell what you're doing. So we sat there for a while, unclear about what my schedule was going to be. And all of a sudden they said, well, the dear leader has asked that you go to the mausoleum to honor his embalmed father. So I go and I do that. And it's not a simple issue because you have to be respectful. On the other hand, you don't want to be overly respectful. So I do that. Then I come back to the guest house, and all of a sudden they said, well, the dear leader will now see you. So we did, in fact, have a press conference, and it was a little bit like out of the 50s with all the old cameras. But we're standing there next to each other, and we're about the same height. And I had on my heels, and I look over, and so did he. His hair was a lot poofier than mine. But I decided to wear a very large American flag because I thought there clearly are going to be pictures of this in their papers and things, and they need to know that Americans were there and how proud I was of the American flag. But that was one of the edgier times that.
And did you not shake his hand? And when you shook his hand, the flag, the large American flag, was just about right in his face?
Yes, very much so. But I have to admit that the whole Dennis Rodman thing is my fault. Because what happened was we did find out that he liked Michael Jordan. And so I took a basketball over that Michael Jordan had autographed, and it is in their Holy of Holies. And so they definitely...
Through the course of your travels, you've had opportunities to visit with first ladies, even widows of world leaders. And one of my favorite stories is the story about the peace dove.
Yep.
And that, if I'm not mistaken, was given to you by Leah Rabin. Maybe you could tell us about that. It's a very interesting story.
What is interesting is they had, the Rabins, he had been ambassador in the United States, and I knew him quite well, and then when he was prime minister, we saw each other fairly frequently. He was assassinated, and I think of every assassination is terrible, but his assassination is one of the greatest historical tragedies, I think, in terms of what could have been. And so what happened was Leah Rabin gave me a dove to wear, and I wore it when I gave Middle East speeches and various times, and then one time I was in Jerusalem, and in my room there was another present, which was a necklace of doves, making it quite clear, as she pointed out, that it took more than one dove to make peace in the Middle East. But I miss that. I do have a replica of it, so I can still wear the dove. But she is the one that she gave me is in the exhibit.
That's wonderful, and the necklace as well is beautiful. We had an opportunity to tour the exhibit and also the galleries today, and one of the more interesting moments that we had was as we were moving through the World Affairs, the International Affairs Gallery, the China Gallery, you noticed a picture of Henry Kissinger. And you're close with Henry Kissinger.
Yes.
And I thought that it was just remarkable. Would you mind sharing what you did when you saw that picture?
Well, first of all, we took a picture of it, and I called Henry Kissinger to say that I was standing there in front of his picture as he's on Air Force One. But my relationship with him is quite remarkable. When I first became Secretary of State, was named Secretary of State, he was the first person to call me. And he said, Madeleine, you have taken away my one unique characteristic of being an immigrant Secretary of State. And I said, no, Henry, I don't have an accent. And then he introduced me at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he said, welcome to the fraternity, Madeleine. And I said, it's not a fraternity anymore. But Henry and I are very, very good friends, as all of the former secretaries are. We are a small group, and one of the things, George Shultz, who held an awful lot of jobs in the government, had told me that the former secretaries of Treasury always gave a dinner for the incumbent, and so he gave a dinner when Condi Rice became secretary, and then when Hillary became secretary, George called, he said, well, I'm going to organize the dinner, and I said, no, George, she's a Democrat, I'm going to organize the dinner. And so we decided not to have a big one, but to have a small dinner at my house. And so I had all the former secretaries of state around my dinner table, and we really are good friends. We spend a lot of time talking to each other, and I talk to all of them a lot.
And that includes?
Yeah.
And that continues to this day, your
Yes.
successor
Well, we all
secretaries
talk,
of state?
you know, we see each other. Actually, Colin Powell and I just did a program at the Library of Congress last week. We do that. And we all talk to each other. Henry and George Shultz and I testified before Senator McCain. And I think that we all feel the same way about what an incredible honor it is to represent the United States and the responsibilities that we have to the country and to the office.
Absolutely. You've mentioned a couple of former secretaries of state, and a couple of those, you were the first woman secretary of state. One of the things that struck me in your book and in our discussion a little bit earlier was the relationship that you have with Hillary Clinton. And that relationship extends even into perhaps the only areas that you might be able to find for a private talk or a private chat. But one of those, the pens that relates to that is the glass ceiling pen.
Yep.
And so if anybody gets a chance to go see that, it's a remarkable pen. It relates, of course, not only to yourself and to Hillary Clinton, but also to Condoleezza Rice as well. And so I just wanted to go off a little bit by bringing reference to Joseph Corbell, your father.
Yeah, right.
And your father continues to have a deep influence in your life and had a great influence on your choice of profession.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about how all that worked? Because you had a fascinating early career, and the way it took its turns was just remarkable.
Yeah. Well, what happened, as Phil mentioned, my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and we spent the war in England. My father was with the government in exile in London and broadcast all through the war over BBC into Czechoslovakia. Then when the war ended, by the way, I spent an awful lot of time in air raid shelters as a child. And so then the war ended. My father went back to Czechoslovakia on the first plane with President Beneš, and then we arrived back. And ultimately, within a couple of months, he was made the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. The little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I used to do for a living. And met a lot of interesting people. One of them was Jan Masaryk, who was the foreign minister of Czechoslovakia at the time. And I remember asking my father, he would always arrive with his arm in a sling, and I would ask my father, why does he always have a broken arm? And they said he doesn't have a broken arm, he just will not shake hands with the communists. And so then I met Tito. I gave flowers to Tito. And so kind of foreign policy was my chosen life from the very beginning. What did happen was that my father's last assignment was to represent Czechoslovakia on a new commission to deal with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. He had been a diplomat for 3 years, or in Yugoslavia for 3 years, and you change posts. And so what happened, he had been named to that, and then in February 1948, there was a communist coup, and my father didn't want to work for the communists, but his best friends in Belgrade were the British and American ambassadors, and they said, your country's just had a coup, this is some commission that is brand new, and if you resign, then they'll name a communist to it, and nothing will ever get done. But if you keep the job and not report to your own government, but report to us, we can actually get something done. So my father went to India and Pakistan and Kashmir to look at it. We came to the United States, and as was said, we arrived November 11th, 1948. And I'll never forget coming, and we lived on Long Island, and So the first Thanksgiving, I remember singing "We Gather Together" to ask for God's blessing, and all of a sudden I heard somebody asking, and I thought, who's asking? And I was asking, and from then on I always asked, and got rid of my English accent. So what happened when my father got to the United States, which was a little later in December, he defected and asked for political asylum, begging Dean Acheson for political asylum, and which he got. And then he had to find a job. And at that stage, the Rockefeller Foundation found jobs for Central European intellectuals, and they found him a job at the University of Denver. We had no idea where Denver was. My parents bought a car. We started driving across America. And my mother said, well, they say Denver's the mile-high city, but we're not going up, so maybe we're going the wrong direction. But ultimately, my father became dean of the Graduate School of International Studies there. And he died in 1977, and by then he was a pretty big deal in Denver, and there were a lot of flowers and tributes at his funeral. And among them was this ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with just some leaves in it. And I said to my mother, where did this come from? And she said, it's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice, which is kind of an amazing story. And so she had, her parents were associated with the University of Denver. She was a music major, hence the piano. And she took an international relations course from my father. He persuaded her to become an international relations major. She got her master's at Notre Dame and was working on her PhD with my father when he died. So this African-American music major from Alabama was writing her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. And in 1987, when I was working for my long list of losing Democratic presidential candidates, I was working for Michael Dukakis to find foreign policy advisors, and I thought, why not call Condoleezza Rice, Soviet expert woman, teaches on the West Coast. So I called her and I told her I was looking for advisors, and she said, Madeleine, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father. So this refugee diplomat basically trained 2 secretaries of state.
And the world is a different place.
It's quite. And by the way, my youngest granddaughter, about 7 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. And because she was seeing Condi and Hillary. And now there are an awful lot of little boys out there who are very encouraged that John Kerry can be Secretary of State.
And I would like to talk about Secretary of State John Kerry in a moment, because boy, does he have his set of challenges. Yep. But first, one thing I've always wondered is the work of a female Secretary of State in world and global affairs, and whether or not you found that to be of significance or not. And what comes to mind is the eagle and the dove, and the situation with, I think, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, yeah. And how that was all of those different nuanced issues and relationships as you and he negotiated through that process. I thought that was a fascinating story.
Well, that story actually happened when I was still ambassador at the UN, and let me talk about it because it's very germane at the moment. Last weekend, or 2 weekends ago, I had went with President Clinton on a presidential delegation to Srebrenica, where a massacre took place in Bosnia, and it had taken us a long time to do something about Bosnia. So what happened was when President Clinton was running for president, he felt that we needed to do something about Bosnia soon, but when he got into office, he could understand the difficulties of moving the system, plus, as you remember, he said it's the economy, stupid, and then there were questions about gays in the military, and Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I, as ambassador at the UN, saw more different diplomats from different countries than any other American diplomat. Whoever was ambassador to Germany saw more Germans or whatever, but I saw everybody. And on a regular basis, they would say, why aren't you doing something about Bosnia? And I was a member of what is known as the Principals Committee. I was a cabinet member, but also a member of the Principals Committee, which is the decision or the body that kind of serves up decisions for the president to make. And I would come in and agitate about the fact that we needed to do something about Bosnia. And so what happened was Colin Powell was a carryover as chairman of the Joint Chiefs from President Bush, and he was the hero of the Western world. He had won the Gulf War, and we were all new, and so he came in, and he was big, handsome man in uniform with medals from here to here, and I was a mere mortal female civilian. And I would say we need to do so. And by the way, the Pentagon briefs better than anybody else, and Colin Powell is a brilliant briefer, the little red pointer. And the Pentagon has three-dimensional pictures and all kinds of things. And what he would do on a regular basis would be to say, well, we can take this particular mountain, but it will take 500,000 troops and $1 zillion. And what are you going to tell Sergeant Slepchak's mother that he has died by stepping on a landmine? So you'd kind of be lost. And I said something, and I said, Colin, what are you saving this military for? What happened was he left, and General Shalikashvili came in as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he decided that we should use force. And so we did, and we actually won the war there. The problem with writing books is that they take a while to get published. And Colin had just written his book, and in it he wrote, I get a phone call from a journalist who says, well, what do you say about what General Powell said about you? And I said, well, what did he say? He said that Ambassador Albright practically gave him an aneurysm by thinking that our soldiers were toy soldiers, and that he patiently had to explain that to me. By the way, Colin and I are really good friends at this point. So, so I called him up and I said, Colin, patiently? And he said, yeah, you understood nothing. And so he then sends me his book, and he signs it with love, admiration, signed patiently, Colin. And I wrote him back a thank you note saying, with love, admiration, etc., forcefully, Madeleine. But there is a question, and I think one of the hardest things in life I never thought I would do would be to send people to fight. And I made it a big point of always, not only when I was at the UN, but as secretary when I was asked to review parades at the academies or visited with our troops everywhere, and I would make it a point of trying to look into their eyes and remember that when I raised my hand or called for the use of force, that these were real people that we were sending somewhere. So very respectful of our armed services, without whom we could not have our freedom.
Absolutely.
And if I might go back to this, to my background, is as a Czechoslovak, the most searing historical event was Munich, when the British and French made an agreement with the Germans and Italians over the heads of the Czechoslovaks, and the United States wasn't there. But as a child, I was in England when our troops were there, when the Yankees came, and it made all the difference in the world. And then when, as a result of agreements made during the war, Czechoslovakia was, quote, liberated by the Soviet Union, that without America. So for me, America has to be engaged. We are the goodness of our power. I believe in the United States.
Well, I think we have time for a couple more questions. I wanted to move into current day situation, current affairs. And it just seems like, from a diplomatic perspective, things are going to hell in a handbasket. It seems associated with that is violence, the likes of which we perhaps have never seen. I think Secretary of State Kerry has been doing a commendable job under very difficult circumstances. And one of the things I wonder, this relates back to your arsenal of diplomacy through your pens and through that messaging, diplomatic messaging. Are the diplomatic demands of today just too much for pens with a message?
No. Well, pins don't do the job, but let me just say the following. I do teach at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And so the course I teach is called the National Security Toolbox. And part of the problem is that there are not a lot of tools in that toolbox. We are the most powerful country in the world. And I saw this when I was in the Carter administration and the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. And we were trying to figure out how to punish the Soviets for what they'd done. We knew that we couldn't push them out immediately. And there was this crazy interagency meeting where people start talking about what they could do. So the idea was to cut off their fishing rights or to have a grain embargo, or we decided not to send our athletes to the Olympics, and we had a call up for the draft. And it made me realize how few tools there were. So the tools that are in the toolbox are diplomacy, bilateral or multilateral, the economic tools, which are either the carrots, trade and aid, or sticks, which are the sanctions, the threat of the use of force, and I know you can't threaten force unless you're prepared to use it, so the use of force, law enforcement, and intelligence, that's it. And the idea is you use these tools in kind of syncopation and try to figure out which one you use. And so diplomacy is the bread and butter of how countries talk to each other. But diplomacy has to work in cooperation with the others. Either when any president of the United States says all options are on the table, it means that the options are force or sanctions. And so what has been happening is it's kind of interesting when I teach about this, is to show how the various tools are being used together, which is what Secretary Kerry has been doing in terms of there were the sanctions being put on Iran, then there's a way now to systematically get them off if they in fact fulfill their obligations. And there's always saying all options are on the table.
How are we doing, Madam Secretary, out there?
Well, I think it's a very hard time, as you pointed out. I think that there's something happening in every part of the world, and the world is very different. We were kind of talking about Henry Kissinger in terms of Henry Kissinger, whom I admire very much, does in fact talk about the world in terms of the Westphalian state system. There are nation states that we still have, but there are an awful lot of non-state actors that are playing a role. Everybody thinks the non-state actors are just the terrorists. Terrorists are non-state actors, but so are multinational corporations and non-governmental organizations, or Bill Gates, people that have a very large influence in foreign policy. And we've been trying to figure out how to use them or be used in terms of tools. I think that what's going on with vacuums in the Middle East in terms of the terrorists and the ISIL, I call them Daesh, which is a word they don't like. It's in Arabic, so that's why I like to call them that. But they are getting more and more power. That's of concern. The agreement with Iran is very important because what we're trying to do is to limit, is to have nuclear proliferation be limited in every way so that the worst weapons don't get into the hands of the worst people. And so there are an awful lot of things happening, and I think what is so important is for us to have the American people understand what our responsibilities are, which countries can help us, because we shouldn't be doing this all alone, and try to figure out how to manage our domestic and foreign policy together.
Well, let's keep our faith and ask for blessings.
Absolutely.
I have time for one more question, and I wanted to shift gears a little bit and ask you to share a personal story. You've written 5 books, and among those 5 books, Madam Secretary, a memoir. The Read My Pens, that's the subject of our discussion tonight in the exhibition here at the library. And your most recent one, which I find just fascinating, which is entitled Prague Winter, A Personal Story of Remembrance and War, 1937 to 1948. And what was remarkable to me was that you had a revelation very late in life that was game-changing in many ways. And some of that game-changing continues to this day. And would you mind sharing what that is all about? It's a fascinating story.
Well, the short story part is I was raised a Catholic, married an Episcopalian, and found out I was Jewish. So, but what happened was the following thing. When I was at the United Nations and my name became public, I got letters from all kinds of people saying, I'm a relative, send money, or I need a visa. And somebody would say, well, and they'd have things all wrong in terms of the names of the villages my parents came from, or this one letter, I remember this man saying, I went to high school with your father in 1915, which would have been impossible because he was born in 1909. And so the letters never made sense. And every once in a while there'd be something in one of those letters that didn't make sense that said they knew my family to be a Jewish family. So what happened was in 1996, in the fall of 96, as I had been named to be Secretary of State, and I was being vetted by the White House lawyers, I got a letter from somebody that had all the names right and the dates right and the villages right, saying that this person, that they knew my family to be a fine Jewish family. So I'm there with the White House lawyers, and they asked me normal questions like, had I paid my taxes and did I have a nanny and things like that. And so then they say, we asked this question of everybody, is there anything that we didn't ask you that you would like to tell us? And I said, well, I just got this letter, and it's perfectly possible that I'm of Jewish origin. And so the lawyer said, so what? The president is not anti-Semitic. So over the holidays, I talked to my children about it, and they had thought my parents were fantastically interesting anyway, and it just kind of added to the whole story. My youngest daughter's married to a Jew, and that made it even better. And so this was, seemed that this was a very interesting and important fact added to my life story. So one of the things that happens is a journalist, Michael Dobbs from the Washington Post, wanted to do a profile of me, and you're not allowed to talk to the press between the time that you're named and the time you're confirmed. But my office gave him names of people that he could be in touch with in the United States as well as in Europe. So 2 days after I actually am confirmed as Secretary of State, he comes into my office in the State Department and starts handing me these disgusting documents, which were copies of index cards that the Nazis kept about who they had sent to concentration camps. And he said, do you recognize this name? Do you recognize this name? So it's one thing to find out you're Jewish. It's another to find out that your family has died in concentration camps. So I had just become Secretary of State, and the only way to describe this is as if I had been asked to represent my country as the first woman in a marathon. But as I was about to start, somebody handed me a package, not only to carry but to unwrap as I ran. So I obviously couldn't, and people didn't think a woman could be Secretary of State anyway, so I couldn't go and figure the story out for myself. So I asked my brother and sister to go to the Czech Republic. They were able to meet a wonderful man, Thomas Kraus, who was head of the Jewish Center in Prague. And they went around to the villages. They began to put the story together and found out that large numbers of my parents' family died in concentration camps. So I have just this summer finally really put it all together. And I took my 3 daughters and 6 grandchildren, and we went to Terezin, where we dedicated a plaque to those that had died there. So 26 members of my family died in the Holocaust. And so I have finally put the story all together. And Prague Winter is not just a story about that, but it's a story about Czechoslovakia and a country that came into existence because of the United States. Thomas Gehrig Masaryk married an American, and by the way, he did something in the last quarter of the 19th century that most men don't do today. He took his wife's maiden name as his middle name. He married an American called Charlotte Gehrig, and his name was Thomas Gehrig Masaryk. The Czechoslovak Constitution is modeled on the American one, with a major exception. It had equal rights language in it in 1918. And this was a model democracy in the interwar period that was sold down the river at Munich and then, quote, liberated by the Red Army. So it's the story of Prague and Czechoslovakia, and I'm glad I was able to write it.
Well, God bless the memory of those 26 family members
yeah.
and all others that suffered such a fate. Before we go to questions, Madam Secretary, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you're here in the library this evening, it's because not only of this great program, but as a result of that, CEO Bill Barabalt and I have agreed to do a buy one ticket, get one free for the next time you want to come back in to see this beautiful exhibition, which it runs through September 27th. So if you came this evening, you were unable to see the exhibition because we closed it at 5, but please come anytime between now and September 27th and enjoy what you've heard about tonight. So thank you very much.
Well, and let me just say thank you to this Presidential Library. I am delighted to have been able to be here. I think the presidential libraries, I've been to a lot of them now, because the pins have been in the Carter and the Clinton and the Ford and Roosevelt and Truman and here, and we're going to go on with the others. And they serve the most amazing purpose in terms of teaching Americans about the presidency and specific presidents, and I think make me very proud of American history. So thank you very much for hosting me.
Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to turn it over to the event.
Yeah, we're going to take a couple of
There you
questions.
are. All right, I see Chris Nordyke back.
Back of the center section, your left-hand side, Secretary Albright. Our first one is from Thomas, who's 19 years old.
Hi, Secretary Albright. Really glad you could make it out here tonight. You helped negotiate the Wye River Memorandum in the late 90s between Benjamin Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat, two people who weren't the best of friends at times. My question has to do with how you think peace in the Middle East in the future can be achieved going forward regarding a two-state solution between Palestine and Israel. Thank you.
Well, by the way, one of the more interesting things was, in fact, to do that at Wye Plantation between the two. They definitely did not get along. There had been some misunderstandings, but ultimately we were able to do it. And part of it had to do with the fact that there was political will to do something. Let me just say the following thing. I think that I happen to believe in the two-state solution. I think that that is the best way to secure the security of Israel and also to have an appropriate way to solve the problem. But the United States can put forward, we used to call them bridging proposals or any number of different ideas, but unless there's political will of the parties involved, nothing is going to happen. And it is interesting. I have to say, President Clinton worked on this until the very last minute, and I think that the plan that was worked out, the Clinton parameters, are still the logical aspect to this in terms of various divisions that were set up then and return of refugees. By the way, if I were to invite any of you to go to Camp David, I think you'd say yes. After 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians, I don't care if I ever go back. But I do think that ultimately what has to happen is the political will of the leaders to meet together, whether it's Prime Minister Netanyahu with President Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinians. I read today in the papers that the Europeans want to get back into it in terms of having the quartet talk, but ultimately there are ideas. We know what the solution is, but it takes the political will of the leaders there.
Our next question is to your right, Secretary. 15-year-old Lauren from Redlands.
Yes, I was wondering if, because of your many pens and the statements that they held, do you believe that anybody was offended or thought wrong of the statement that you were trying to set for it?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. Can you say it again?
Chris, could you?
Because of the pins that you collected and the statements that they held, do you think anyone felt offended by them?
They should have. So let me just say this. The Russians had been bugging the State Department, literally. They had bugged a room right next to the office of the Secretary of State. We found this person sitting outside listening to us. We did what diplomats do, which is to do a démarche. to Moscow to say this is unacceptable. But the next time I met with the Russians, I wore this huge bug. And they knew exactly what I was doing. Yeah, so.
Those are in the edgy category.
Yeah. Well, then I will tell the story. Pins got me into trouble, but they got me out of trouble also. So one of the things, there's a picture, and you'll see it, at the 50th anniversary of NATO, President Clinton and Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen and I were sitting on a sofa, and I don't know who did it first, but we did the hear no evil, see no evil monkeys. We looked like crazy people. And so I was somewhere, and I was able to buy 3 monkey pins, and they're in the show. And what happened was we had the summit with the Russians in the summer of 2000, and I wore the monkey pins, and we're walking in, and President Putin turns to President Clinton and says, so we always notice what pins Secretary Albright wears. Why are you wearing those monkeys? And I actually said the following thing, which was, because I think your policy in Chechnya is evil. And he got furious at me, and he said, you shouldn't be talking to the Chechens. And I thought, I have really screwed up. President Clinton looked at me and thought, you are the chief diplomat. You've just ruined the whole summit. So that was when I went too far. But the pins have gotten me out of trouble, and this is racier. I actually invented the art of diplomatic kissing, which is, I mean, you can't visualize Henry Kissinger going to a country and having a big embrace. So anyway, much more complicated than meets the eye, because the Latins, some kiss on the right cheek and some on the left cheek, and very confusing, so a lot of bump noses. And the French kiss twice, and the Dutch kiss 3 times. And then there was Yasser Arafat, just the thought, right? So very complicated. So by the way, we had to teach President Clinton how not to be kissed by Arafat. You want to get up? I'll show you.
Yes.
So you have to go. Anyway, so
Right in the solar plexus.
I went to Korea, and I come back from Korea, and I get a call from a journalist. They said, don't you think that the foreign minister of South Korea should be fired for what he said about you? And I said, well, what did he say? And he said, well, I really like it when Secretary Albright's here, because we're about the same age, and I'm this tired old man, and she's full of vim and vigor. And besides, when I embrace her, she has very firm breasts. So what do you have to say about that? So I said, well, I have to have something to put those pins on.
There's another occasion where the secretary upset some folks with her pins, and that was the press. And one of my favorite pins, the mushroom pin.
Oh, yes.
If you want to tell that
Well,
briefly.
what happened was, and this has to do with Middle East talks, these were ones that were going on between Israel and Syria. And I made a point, the press just drove me crazy because they wanted to have readouts of the meetings all the time. And I said, sometimes peace talks and mushrooms need to grow in the dark. And so every time they asked me a question, I would just say mushrooms, mushrooms. I'm sure that they thought I was talking about something else, but anyway, ultimately, we were looking for mushroom pins all the time so that I could just point to the mushroom pins. So.
And there is a time and a place.
Yeah.
Next question is in the back of the center section.
Hi, thank you for coming. I read once that you said that some of the disagreements that you had with some of President Clinton's other national security staff regarding the Balkans was due to your historical point of reference, and that you felt that you were using Munich and they were sometimes using Vietnam. I'm wondering, if you were Secretary of State today negotiating with Iran, what historical point of reference would you be using?
Well, let me just say, by the way, and that was the discussion that was going on between Colin Powell and me, because his background was Vietnam and mine was Munich, and that I believed that one had to stand up. But I do think that the reference point that I would probably use are very complicated diplomatic talks. What I think is interesting is, and this is a good place to talk about it, is when you are doing something that people don't expect and is very difficult. And President Nixon going to China is a reference point in terms of how you deal with a country that you disagree with, that you know that there have to be certain approaches to it, and try to figure out how to deal with it. Or what President Reagan did with Gorbachev. And so I think that the point of diplomacy, it provides the method of talking to those with whom you disagree. That is the whole purpose of diplomacy, and trying to figure out what can be arranged. And let me just say the following thing. Diplomacy, the very important part about it, and I have to say, I have very much, I was certainly around when President Nixon went to China. I think that reading Henry Kissinger's books about how the whole thing took place is most informative and brilliant in terms of the following thing where a point of reference works, and that is that if you're going to have a diplomatic exchange or make a diplomatic agreement, you have to put yourself into the other country's shoes to understand there is no such thing as a zero-sum agreement that is going to hold unless you defeat somebody in war. And so the point here is that there need to be a way of trying to see both sides, and President Nixon was able to do that. Yeah.
Next question is to your left. This is Franklin from Riverside.
Hi, pleasure to finally see you in person. This question is regarding Russia. Given that we've seen Putin's grasp of Russia's direction as well as Russian history during relatively economic prosperity, what do you think economic recession will do to his beliefs and course of action, whether acting as a catalyst or as a neutralizer?
Well, let me just say this. I used to be known as a Soviet expert. I have spent a lot of my time looking at Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. And what is interesting, if one goes back on the post-Cold War history of Russia and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is that I was involved in '91 when I was teaching and a private citizen of doing a whole series of attitude surveys all across Europe, including Russia, Ukraine, and Lithuania in '91. And there were questionnaires and then also focus groups. And I will never forget one focus group outside of Moscow where this man stands up and says, "I'm so embarrassed. We used to be a superpower, and now we're Bangladesh with missiles." And so there really was a complete loss of identity for the Russians. One of the things that was interesting, to go specifically to the economics, in the early 90s, oil prices were high, and Russia was able to sell oil and in fact did not have economic issues, and they did not do any reforms. That is part of their problem. And so whatever we are doing in terms of sanctions against Russia because of what they did in Ukraine, their problem is basically the low oil prices and lack of economic reforms beyond privatization that created a lot of corruption and a group of oligarchs around Putin. So I do think that part of and the Russians, I have to say, I have great admiration for what they did during World War II. They are people that can put up with an awful lot, and they are suffering at the moment, but they also have bought into what Putin is doing, which is kind of buying into what the man who said that we are Bangladesh with missiles. What Putin has done is try to identify himself with Russian greatness and to make sure that they are able to suffer some of the economic things that are happening to them for the sake of regaining their identity. I think it's very complicated. I am not a shrink, but I do think that a lot of it, of what Putin is doing, is psychological and trying to revive Russia's greatness through his own greatness. He's a KGB officer, is what he is. And I think that we have to be really careful of the way that he makes up facts. He has his own parallel version of history, and that this is all the fault of the United States. And what I'm really troubled by is that what he basically has, I'm sorry actually that we said we won the Cold War. The truth is they lost the Cold War, and that's not just a semantic difference. Communism does not work, and it fell apart, and it's their responsibility, not ours. Yeah.
as Mike said, we have such a tremendous turnout today that we've got some folks in our overflow. We asked them to write down some questions, and Samaya, to my right, has gone and collected those, and she has a question she would like to answer on behalf of those folks in the theater.
So this question's from Michelle. She asks, what inspired your quote, "There's a special place in hell for women who can't help other women"?
Yeah. So I have to say it came from my own experience. I went to college sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. So it's a long time ago, and I did go to a women's college, Ellzey, and where we had great role models, and women were the leaders. But people wanted to get married, and I waited a really long time to get married, 3 days after graduation. And I then was trying to figure out what my life was going to be. I had children very early, and I was working on my PhD a lot of the time, endlessly. And other women would say to me, why are you always in the library when you could be in the carpool line, and you are not really a very good mother? And every woman's middle name is guilt, I can assure you. I'm sure you're never in the right place. You either are working and you're not home with your children, or you're home with your children and you wish you were working. And what happened was it was the other women that made me feel inadequate and always wrong. And I noticed that more and more, that as I got into the workforce, that there's the queen bee syndrome of if there's only going to be one woman, then it's not going to be you, it's going to be me, and not really supporting each other. And so I feel very strongly that it is better to be supportive. Now, I bet you that every single woman in this room has had this experience, which is you are in a meeting, you are the only woman in there, and you think, I'm going to make a comment. And then you think, I don't think I'll say it because everybody will think it's stupid. So then some man says it, everybody thinks it's brilliant, and you are really mad at yourself for not having said anything. And what will happen is that the men will say, well, as Joe said, they support each other. And if there was another woman in the room, she might say, as Mary said, and there would be a support system. And I think it's just better if, in fact, women support each other. So that it's the single most important thing I ever said.
Our next question is to your left. This is Mohammed from UCR.
Hi, you seem like a smart lady and you have a lot of experience in foreign policy. Do you have any advice for any foreign-born person trying to get into foreign policy? Something like that.
Let me say this. I am an immigrant and very proud to be an American. If people had asked me and they do ask me what's the most important thing that ever happened to me, it's becoming an American. And so I do think immigrants do an awful lot for this country and are willing to contribute. And I do think that there's a very good way in terms of using your background and your knowledge to get into foreign policy. There are an awful lot of us that are there, and I think that we bring a different view. And this country is what it is because of the incredible diversity that we have and of the respect for people that have come here for one reason or another, either with their families or on their own, who want to be Americans. And so good luck to you. And I think it's you have to have a good education, otherwise you can't get into foreign policy, and to decide that you're going to work very hard and understand the gift of being in America.
Our next question is back in the center section. This is Liz from Fullerton.
Hi, Miss Albright. I was wondering what advice you would have for a young woman seeking a life in politics.
I think that, first of all, I love politics, and I'm really sorry when the word politician is viewed as a derogatory term. Being a politician is somebody who serves in terms of explaining what the system is about, to be kind of the intermediary between the government and the people, and I think it's an honorable term. And I do think that I hope very much that people see going into politics as a good thing to do, to serve your country and to be able to participate in public discourse. It is very difficult, there's no question. And I think there are some things going on at the moment that are very, very disturbing. I started my political life actually in college. I think it's obvious I'm a Democrat. And at Ellzey there was very few of us, and so this was during the campaign for Adlai Stevenson running for president. And so we all went into Boston to raise money for Democrats. This was my first introduction to fundraising, which was some crusty old man walked by and said, "Not $1 for the Democrats, but $5 for you, baby." So that is how it began. I do think that one of the issues in politics these days is the amount of money that it takes. And the amount of money that's generally part of the political system, I think due to a very mistaken decision by the Supreme Court. So I do think that it's important to get into politics. I wish you the best. I think it's important not to think you can run for president immediately. But I do think that getting in at local levels and being involved in politics is a terrific thing to do. Good luck.
Another question from our friends in our overflow seating in our theater from Samaya.
If the sanctions are lifted for Cuba, do you think the United States will change the benefits that are currently extended to those that make it their home?
That make what their home?
Make Cuba their home.
Well, I think that that one of the issues, it's a complicated question in terms of, and let me just explain that initially the embargo was an executive act. It was President Eisenhower, then followed by President Kennedy, and it was an executive act until what happened, as I described, the shoot down of the unarmed civilian planes, when it became a law, the Helms-Burton law. And in order for the sanction, the embargo, to be lifted, Congress has to do that. And we are waiting to see whether that will happen or not. I think that part of the issue, and the reason that I think the embargo should be lifted and should have been, is that Castro has used it as an excuse to have a lousy system in Cuba, and that the people in Cuba, once they are able to have a normal life, will have the benefits of living in a beautiful place, but also because they will be able to participate in the international economy.
We have time for one last question. We do have a book signing arranged. I want to remind everyone here in our East Room and in the theater that we do not have time to take photographs with Secretary Albright. There's just too vast of a crowd. Folks leaving the East Room should line up along the left side of this long hallway. Folks leaving the theater, if they'd like to get their book signed, should line up along the left side of the Great Room. Those not wanting to get a book signed can exit through our museum store. Our last question from this gentleman right here.
Hello, this is Ayman Aziz. I'm a Syrian American. My question is not about the Syrian conflict and how to resolve it. You talk about toolbox, and it takes a lot to be engaged. What is it that we have to do in this country to take more than 500 Syrian refugees after having displaced more than 12 million?
What to do about the Syrian refugees?
Why aren't we taking more than 500 so far after 4 years?
I have to say the following thing. I think that what has happened with the Syrian refugees generally is outrageous. I went to a camp in Jordan where there were Syrian refugees, and Jordan, which is a small country, has the equivalent as if the United States had 40 million refugees. We can't even deal with 11 million undocumented workers, and I think we need to take in more refugees. There are 60 million refugees in the world, and they are living terrible lives. The United States, it goes a little bit to the questions about what can immigrants do in this country, and I do think that it would be a good idea for us to be more generous in terms of taking refugees in.
Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Albright and Director of the Nixon Library, Michael Ellzey. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you very much.